and the Black Power generation, and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba T'Shaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba T'Shaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba T'Shaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers, family of this show, the Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. How's everybody doing? And I see that we have Brother Gawa here, Sister Robin, Sister Peggy Parks Miller, and Gloria Briscoe. Greetings. Thanks. I want to thank everybody for the interest that you've shown over these 5 years in this show. And I want to thank those that have made donations because that helps, because this has been fairly costly doing this show. So I appreciate those donations. For people who are watching the show and you're new, as you come in, hit the red button, and that puts you into the subscriber category. I know some people say they don't know how to do it. Just look for the red button, hit it. And also hit the button that shows that you like the show. And that helps the algorithms, which are definitely stacked against us. Shonda Henderson, greetings. Just before getting into today's show that is very important, I wanted to make a few comments on what's been going on in the country. And we told you this was going to happen. Trump told you this was going to happen. And it's happening. And so what we're seeing now is rising fascism. It's the beginning of it. I mean, the guy's just into 8 months of his operation. And what you have is fascism American style. And see, those who take a little bit of knowledge and stretch it the wrong way say, oh, this is the same thing. This has happened before. This is what you call denial in psychology. No two periods of history are exactly the same. And while this is the second post-Reconstruction, this is the second post-Reconstruction. Hey, Brother Lawrence Freelo. He's in Benin. Wow. Right on. This is the second post-Reconstruction. And the first, they restored slavery. They're trying to do that now. The difference between these two periods is we got some real power now. We had some then. We made the difference in the Civil War. We won the Civil War. Quit saying Lincoln freed you. And most of you don't know this piece of history. When Ulysses Grant was elected president, he was a person who had developed a respect for blacks because blacks saved his behind in the Civil War, saved the Union's behind. Now, he was the second reason that the Union won. It was him and us. Before they had him, they didn't have a good general to lead the army. And before they had us, they didn't have the fighters who could take out their former masters. Now, let me give you a little historical fact that none of you know. When Grant first ran for office, you would think he swept into office. He was the general of the Civil War. For the North. He won it. That gets you a seat in the White House, right? No. That was a close election. Do you know what he won by? 400,000 votes. Do you know where those 400,000 votes came from? They came from Black people. 400,000 Black people voted, and they all had enough sense to vote for Ulysses Grant. Why? Most of you don't know this, some do. Grant felt compelled to break up the Klan. Did you know that? But it was a subtle breakup. I would have preferred a much harder, bloody one. But they took South Carolina as the model because they had more allies in South Carolina. Why? Majority African state. Did you know that? And what they did is they eviscerated the Klan. And all they had to do is do it in one state. And that knocked the Klan out. The Klan didn't come back again until the 20th century. Other right-wing groups did. So Blacks were key in that. Some of us chose to stay home in this last election, though Blacks are not responsible for Trump being in office because 85% of us showed sense. And I get sick and tired of the so-called nationalists putting down the grassroots. The grassroots are the ones with power. And it's only when the grassroots move does any change take place. When 97% of Black people decided to stand up in Montgomery, Alabama, then you had the first defeat of what you call white supremacy. I call it declining. I don't use that term anymore, even though it looks like it's back. This is a seesaw struggle we're in because there's a demographic shift going on in this country, and Trump, the Supreme Court, and the Republicans and a good number of Democrats seem like they're almost on the same side. They want to do everything possible, particularly the Republican Supreme Court and Republicans in Congress, to let Trump do what he wants, but particularly to tweak the system so that as they become a minority, they can still rule. Well, minorities rule anyway. Yes, so a minority of whites have ruled in this country, but this demographic shift is a shift that has never occurred before in human history, where a ruling group and their masses who make up the majority are becoming the minority. And it's already in the case with birth rates. You're seeing the Black and brown birth rates displace the white one. Uh-oh. And quit calling yourself 40 million. As Ibrahim Traoré pointed out, we're 70 million. And that's the number they give for Latinos. And by the way, Latinos not a race. And many Latinos, second generation Black, baby. And if you look Black, you Black. You hear me? So this isn't just a numbers shift. It's a cultural shift. And those, because, we have some people on the Ignornet, because there's 3 nets, AfroNet, the InfoNet, and the Ignornet. You got some Ignornet popular people because the algorithms favor them. So they get up and gossip all the time. So you got one that's real popular. And what did he tell Black people? Let's just forget this election this time. It's a boy who promised to build a school and never built one. You got a famous economist, Black economist, who's probably pretty good with economics, telling Black people not to vote. Well, keep your mouth shut on what you don't know. And it's just like, do you think that if Black people had the final say-so in 1876, it would have come out that way? No. And why is it that we beat Trump in 2020? Because we got the power when it's organized properly. Now, Blacks are not responsible for Trump being in office. We're the strongest bloc in anything we do. 85% of blacks went the right way. But I've seen some dumb blacks who could tell you, some calling themselves nationalists, I hope very few, and others supposed to be informed, they voted for Trump. You voting for slavery? You a fool? Or, as you will see in this discussion today, it may be another condition that you suffer from. Maybe we can cure it and maybe we can't, but that's a shame. So what we're seeing going on right now is fascism, American style. Remember when Hitler moved on the Jews, he was using the American example as the model. He sent experts here to study this country, to figure out how could you be in the world getting a reputation for being a democracy when your country was based on genocide, slavery, and stealing half of Mexico. He wanted to know, how could you do that? So he used fascism, German style. The Jews were like, come on, the cover. And of course, 6 million of them went up in smoke. You know, they put them in gas ovens. And then they did it to the gypsies and they did it to the left or anybody that opposed Hitler. What you're seeing now is fascism, American style. So what is that? You do it in a way that whites aren't going to feel too threatened. So when he came after the civil service, what was the cover? Huh? What was it? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. He told you when he was on the road running this campaign, that was his cover. You know, those blacks are stealing everything from you. No, it's the rich whites who are stealing everything from you. But just use the boogeyman, the black people. You know what I mean? And you have the cover. And so that was the cover for doing in what? White women in high positions in the military. A majority of the federal jobs that they cut were white, but they went after as many blacks as they could because whites have 60% of the federal jobs. We have 18%, which is higher than our percentage, you know, in the country. And then some of us will say, oh, that's nothing new. Oh, yeah. The main source of jobs for blacks is local, state, and federal government and small business. And small business is a major source of jobs for everybody in the country. But our small businesses only employ, for the most part, over 90% one person because they don't get the capital because we're under colonialism, or what I call indirect colonialism. So what we're seeing is that's the disguise for doing everybody else in. The same thing with the bill they passed that they call the Great Beautiful Bill, which is the Big Dirty Bill, which has carried out the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. And so you're seeing the cut of Medicaid. You're seeing the cut of SNAP to the tune of probably 20 million each. SNAP is food for people that are hungry. And there are over, according to Reverend Barber, who is Bishop Barber, who is a conscious black preacher, there's 160 million poor people in this country. 160 million. So what happens when you take 20 million people out of getting any extra allocations for food? And that includes the food that kids get in schools. You understand? And what happens when, because these cuts are one, they're lying and saying they haven't done it, but it's obvious that they have. The bill they passed says so, but it's not scheduled to take effect until after the midterm elections. And most of the big effects will occur just before Trump is out of office or when Trump goes out of office. That's what's happening there. You understand? Huh? And don't be running around saying this is the same old thing. I hear some very conscious nationalists say that because they haven't studied the current situation. Oh, the Democrats and Republicans are the same, except for Biden. Biden actually put forward some good stuff that the Negroes didn't either know or seem to care. And if they didn't care, then that's another problem. The majority of our people had enough sense to know what was going on because we're the smartest group in this country and the most cohesive. And that's the grassroots especially, and those who are conscious on any other sphere. So what we're seeing is now military occupation of cities. Which cities? Black run. Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. They're going to Chicago. I'm sure they're coming to Oakland. You understand? And then now, this is really interesting. They're sending in military National Guard forces from southern states and Ohio. Huh? And I was listening to a speech that Vance was giving, lying about what this bill contains. And he was asked, would Trump be sending troops into Minneapolis? Now, technically, that's a Democratic state. But his answer was only if we're asked to. Really? Huh? So the generals have said that they are opposed to using the military in cities to occupy cities. They're opposed to that. But now they've got a head of the of the Defense Department who will do whatever he's told to do. So this is part of what's going on, so that whites can think, it's not affecting us. It's just blacks. And then you have Rahm Emanuel coming on, who was Obama's chief of staff, saying that, well, yeah, there are certain areas where this is needed, like car theft. What kind of stuff are you talking about? You're talking about military occupation of cities to stop stealing some cars? Huh? The National Guard ain't trained in anything that's got to do with crime, let alone going after people who have stole cars. And that justifies entering cities. And I heard one Democrat say, oh, well, yeah, I have to investigate this and see how is it being done. And are they putting the troops in the right area, meaning where he says there's high crime. And this is occurring at a time in which crime is down. And the person who's ordering this happens to be who has been convicted of so many crimes it's hard to count. I think it's 34. Huh? So this is fascism, American style. And, we should not think that this is just another thing. And then the attacks on institutions that disseminate history, and the attempt by the Trump administration to remove all evidence of African and African-American history. And you say, well, that's been going on. Yeah, there's been ban the books and all this kind of stuff, but no, not like this. This is, at this point, not the same thing. You understand? The Republicans rose up on the issue of removing the Black presence in West Point. Because guess what? We got some of the best warriors in the world. I mean, you're going to remove the Black presence. That means Hannibal is out of military doctrine. And if you know anything about Hannibal, and I'm a warrior, I studied Hannibal carefully. He's one of the best warriors in the history of the whole wide world. I don't care, actually, on this one. It would be good to remove it, because then you don't know the best military strategy. Go right ahead and do that. You know what I mean? I do care, because I don't want our presence removed. And then the attack on the African-American Museum on History, Obama's been silent on that so far. The Democratic Party is silent on that so far. Huh? That's a crown jewel for us that one of our congressmen pushed for. And it happened under Obama's administration. John Lewis, that was his project. And it's one of the most beautiful structures ever built. I don't know why Obama didn't use him rather than put together this ugly presidential library he's got. This boy ain't got any taste, along with some other things. So what we're seeing is this is serious. And I'm going to tell you, if you're not involved in something that's building some power for Black people and not compromised by the system, then you got yourself to, in part, blame for this in that you think you're just going to sit back and hide. And if you're going to operate out of fear, then you're doing exactly what they want you to do. So there's a lot more going on there. We'll cover it in other shows. I just wanted to briefly remind you of what we've covered in the last 2 weeks. And these two shows have been extremely important. The first one was the show by Captain President Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, his address to African Americans. Now, some people have said this is a AI, artificial intelligence thing. That's half true. This is an original address delivered by Ibrahim Traoré in French originally, but then translated into English. And so they used the same speech and they used AI to give him a voice. Ogawa has schooled me on this. I said, tell me this earlier so I can keep people up at the right time, because people were asking questions and I was given half the right answer, but I didn't have the whole correct answer because I'm not up on this AI as much as I should be. I know enough. Well, I know something, but I don't know enough. So this is, they use the technology of AI to give him an English voice and a certain sound that's English. But the content is his. It's all his. So let me tell you something. If you're conscious, you would know that certain things can't possibly be put out by AI. That was such a subtle, profound, radical speech that, you know, it was beyond good. It was bad. It demonstrated that not only is Ibrahim Traoré sharp and conscious, but he's got advisors who know what the hell's going on, and in a deep way. That's one of the most profound speeches I've heard coming from an African leader, period. You know, this was a speech that did positive and negative. It was not a speech of, oh, it's all gloom and doom and it ain't all good. What he did is he talked about the power of the African American, 70 million strong. He talked about the movements of resistance, the Black Freedom Movement, the Black Power Movement, the Black Panther Movement, the Garvey Movement. On the positive side, he also showed how the state went out and smashed some of those organizations, the Black Panther Party, Garvey's movement. Some of the smashing, I'm going to say, that's left for another discussion, due to our own mistakes, because the state's coming after you. How smart are you in your strategies? And I'm not going to go into saying who and what. I'm just going to say there were some major mistakes made by a few of our movements that made them more vulnerable to attack. And they could have done better had they thought through their strategies more carefully. And having a big mouth is not a strategy. We get really blown up by Black people who stand up and shout at the enemy and doing all this stuff. That ain't bad. What's bad is winning. Remember my 3 rules, WWW, win, win, and win. And I've lost no battles, and I've been in some rough ones, and they've tried to take my butt out 3 times, as well as jobs and everything else. And I'm not complaining. That's the nature of war. If you get in a ring, you're going to expect to get hit. I just try and keep it to a minimum. And I'm not into martyrdom. So I ain't looking to be no martyr for anybody. Anybody that wants to, well, I'm sorry for you. I'm not interested in having no holidays in my name. I like to tap dance. You know where? It certainly isn't on a dance floor. So the speech by Captain President Ibrahim Traoré was magnificent. And what was he saying? Basically, he was reaching out to African and Americans and offering them a place, us, if we want to go home. Don't come to make money, come to help build Africa, you know? and there's a place for you. It was a very profound speech. In the case of last week, we were blessed to have Brother Willie Mikasa Dada Ricks and his beautiful wife. I asked for her to be on that show, and I'm glad she was, because you got a real balanced presentation there. And that was a show that was going into what they actually saw when they went to Burkina Faso. And so that gave you an inside look. However, there was more to it than that couldn't be covered in that show, because it was some beautiful pictures and you got to see things. And then the outcome that Brother Mikasa Dada Ricks, who's a bad brother, by the way. He's a bad brother. I really like him. He got the spirit, and his wife, both of them, they got the spirit. Got a son who's in his 30s, who's trained in Cuba in medicine and is leading a party of Cuban doctors of 120 or so in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, living in Cuba. What kind of mindset do you have when you do that? Huh? And fluent is, Willie says, in 7 languages. And Willie himself is much smarter than he plays on. He dropped out of high school, scored highest in the math scores, I think, in the state of Tennessee. And he's a chess player. And when he put forward Black Power, that was a strategic move. I've told you before what Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael, who's my friend, told me. He said, you know, we're on this march. Now, I know it went a little bit more complicated than this, but he said, Willie whispered in my ear, say Black Power. And then Stokely, later Kwame Ture, said, you know, I mentioned this in the last show, but I have to repeat this. He said, you know, Willie kind of crazy, but I did it. Blew up the world. Black Power is going to get your mama, your daddy, your sister, and your brother. King felt uneasy with it, but he never denounced it, but he would have rather that it not been said. But this was the shift from the older leadership that wasn't that much older to the younger leadership that had undergone a transformation of consciousness. And that's what this show is going to be dealing with. So that was a very valuable show. So let's get into today's show. The day's show has as its central topic the Black mind. Because without the Black mind, there's no direction for the Black behind. You hear me? If the Black mind is off, everything else is off. So this is going to be the heavy focus of this, but this is a return for Captain President Ibrahim Traoré's magnificent gesture towards us. And so this is my attempt to say that we love you, we love Africa, we love African people, and I want to salute this brother. I want to salute his leadership team. I want to salute the people of Burkina Faso and the people of Africa. So this presentation is for Africa and for Africans wherever they are in the world, but especially addressed to Africa. Ibrahim Traoré humbly stated that his qualifications for speaking to us was that he had looked imperialism in the eye and didn't blink. That was a very humble rationale. He didn't say they've tried to kill me numerous times. He didn't say a member of his family sent some perfume to him that had poison in it. He didn't say one of his leading generals was offered $5 million to kill him. He didn't say that. Huh? A humble man. A brave man. And so this is my attempt to say a few words to my people in Africa. And what are my qualifications? Only one thing: sincerity. 66 years in the Black liberation movement and not taking a dime for it. And I've done this for one reason. I love African people more than I love myself, though I'm no fool. There's some Africans not worth loving. Huh? So don't think that I'm out here on some crazy trip. Every assassination run on me, it was some blacks sent to do it, but black people didn't send them. The government did. And in one case, they sent a real good one. And I said, well, good. Now let's dance. You finally sent somebody with some sense. The other ones wanted to bludgeon you, shoot you, and all this stuff. But now it's low intensity. I had studied it. You hear me? So I'm just simply saying that what I'm presenting is out of love, pure and simple, for my people. This show is an act of love. I mean, I'm coming out of my pocket for this. I ain't getting nothing out of this except what I can share with you and what I learned from you. And it's what you put into the pot. And then people like Chad Jomo Kenyatta, some of these new Black Panthers, those coming out of Black Lives Matter, those who have been active in the streets, those are the people that are most important for me, you know, and everyone else is. But the ones who put their words into actions, they're the ones that matter the most. So my topic for today is Malcolm X said, Black people cannot have a negative view of Africa and a positive view of themselves. This is a very important point. Put another way, the only way you're going to have a positive view of yourself is to have a positive view of Africa. And anytime you see a low self-esteeming, remote control, automatic pilot, double O soul Negro, you can believe that the hatred of Africa and the hatred of their roots goes along with it. And it's almost subliminal. And the more miseducated they are, the more brainwashed they are if they have not freed their mind. So this is the topic for this morning. And it's especially for our people in Africa, but our people around the world. Now, I've said this before. My allegiance is not to the Star-Spangled Banner. My allegiance is to the spiritual blues and the spiritual blues people. Because my father, W.H., who was kicking the behinds of the Klan when he was 12 years old, is from Louisiana. You hear me? Not the Star-Spangled Banner, the spiritual blues. And to people like Marie Lavernoux, a voodoo queen from Louisiana. You hear me? Huh? I'm a spiritual blues man. You hear me? But my allegiance is not to the Star-Spangled Banner, also because my grandmother, Catherine Filardi, who was as beautiful as midnight, who walked with the pride of a queen as her daughter did, who was my mother, Sylvia Bradley, who, as my grandmother said, walked like she owned the world, but didn't have a pot to pee in or a window to throw it out. She was a tell me person. If she went for a job where they didn't hire Black people, she said, they'll have to tell me. Huh? And on her deathbed, it was a while before she died, she asked me, grandson, will Black people ever rule themselves? And she was out marching in the Black freedom movement in San Francisco, took off from the jobs, cleaning white people's kitchen. She had a couple of years of college, and that's all she could get. Poorer than a church mouse, but rich in pride, rich in love. And that's why I'm a spiritual blues man. You hear? I'm a muddy waters man. A hoochie coochie man. I'm not a hoochie coochie man in practice, but you know what I mean? Born on the 7th hour of the 7th day in the 7th month, when the 7 doctors say, born with good luck, and can't you see? I got $700 and don't you mess with me. And if you listen to that song, it's voodoo all up in there. So my allegiance is to my people. When I was brainwashed, I was in the Marine Corps. When I was brainwashed, a lieutenant colonel in the ROTC. But when I got into this movement, the Black Freedom Movement, then I joined the Black Freedom Army, and I've been in it ever since. And so I want to start this with the song that is the national anthem of Blacks in slavery, that really speak to the spirit of the enslaved Africa. And we sang it all the time in the movement. And so I want you to hear from Carol Stallings, beautiful sister of a friend of mine in Pan-African People's Organization, ACARA. It's her sister. Carol Stallings is a major singer. And I want you to hear, Oh Freedom.
Oh, freedom.
That was Carol Stallings singing at my 80th birthday. I'm 86 now. I won't have another major birthday. There's about 70, 75 people that came out for that. I won't have the next one until I'm 90, and then the next one at 100. And I'm going to live past 100. Take a look at me. And it ain't just the way it looks. When you're on this freedom train, baby, it energizes you, especially if you take care of your health. So my love of Africa is tied to our people's and my love of freedom. The two equate to the same thing, because freedom for African people has its roots in Africa. And so this discussion today on, if you're going to have a free mind, you need to have a positive view of Africa, and then a deep knowledge of it, because you'll know yourself better. And self-knowledge is the key to all knowledge, and it is the key to self-love. Without self-love, you have nothing. So in discussing this topic today of Africa, I want to start with, first of all, this comment by Malcolm here, that Black people cannot have a negative view of Africa and a positive view of themselves. And then I want to start with this man, Edward Wilmot Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden was one of the two most brilliant people that we produced in the 19th century. Him and Martin R. Delaney. They were the two leading thinkers. He came from the Dutch Caribbean islands in the Caribbean. To give you a little background on him, he tried to get an education in the United States and was denied admission to American universities because of the blackness of his skin. So he went to Liberia, and at that time, he was able to get a good education at the University of Liberia, and he specialized in languages and in the classics. And then he became a professor at the University of Liberia. And then after that, he became the foreign minister for the Court of St. James to Britain and Secretary of State of his country. And then later worked in the interior of Africa that enabled him to see traditional African systems, because most educated Blacks had a very, very poor view of African culture. And we'll see why in a minute. And some still do. And so Edward Wilmot Blyden did a number of things. His most important intellectual achievement that most scholars don't think is his most important intellectual achievement is a book called Africa, Life and Customs. I'll show it again when I have the bigger screen on. African Life and Customs. And I bought this probably in the late 60s. The book cost me $2. So, you know, when this was written, it was written in the 1870s, only 90 pages long. It's his best work. Most people think Christianity, Islam, and the Negro it's an important book, but this is the most important work by Blyden. And by the way, Garvey read it, because going through the materials on Garvey in Tony Hill's multi-volumes on Garvey, I found that he had gone through the British Library, the National Library in Britain, and he had read it, but I don't think he really got the message. It was a little too hard to get into his head. I'll go into that later. Blyden, I'm going to start with Blyden, because this is an address to Africa and to Africans wherever we are. And Edward Wilmot Blyden had some of the best insights into the state of Africans at that time that applies to the state of Africans today. And Brother Ibrahim Traoré has stated as much. He said the biggest challenge that his revolution faces is inside of Africa and inside of his own country, because he knows the previous leader of Burkina Faso was assassinated by his best friend, paid to do it. So what would lead somebody to do that? And so he's aware of what this internal contradiction is, because he's an awakened African. So Blyden was important in the 19th century because he led the opposition forces within Africa. Though he came from the Dutch West Indies, the Dutch Caribbean islands, he lived in Africa. He was an African of deep consciousness. And he was, in his thinking, a radical. And so he led the movement in Africa against the oppression of Africans, and particularly against colonialism. Blyden had an analysis, and this is an analysis that applies to us to today. This is why I'm going to start with him in an address to Africa. And is one that Africa still faces, but is dealing with, because now you're having a rise of radical transformation in Africa. And you've had the same rise in the United States, but it hasn't affected everyone, you know? A lot of us are still asleep. So Blyden criticized the European missionary system for promoting through its system and teachings mental slavery. Mental slavery. He said, because this is after the slave trade is ended by the British, he says that this physical slavery has been replaced by mental slavery. And so The missionary project was just one of a number of projects designed to do that. Another was the educational project, that would be a project where Europeans would bring in their own, not only European history, but their method for teaching it, and lay that on Africans, lay that on the Caribbean, and lay that on Blacks in the United States. So mental slavery, he said, was the central problem. You remember Bob Marley talking about freeing us from mental slavery. And if you look at El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, that was his major mission, was to free the Black mind. And if you look at the movements of the 60s in this country, the United States, its greatest gain, to the extent that it was successful, because it was not successful for all Black people, it was the freedom of the Black mind. King observed it. He called it the New Negro. Garvey said the same thing. It was the New Negro. He observed that in these struggles that came out of Montgomery, and in the case of Garvey, that came out of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, that there was an awakened Black person. In fact, the awakening of Black people in this country woke Garvey up. It's a contrary position where people assume that Garvey came in, awakened, and woke us up. No, Garvey came in a proud Maroon, but Garvey was also a colonial subject of Britain. And so this very thing that Blyden talked about that put us into mental slavery, Garvey was into some of it too. And he believed in the King of England, King George. He sent him a letter telling him how much he loved him. See, most of y'all don't know this, and Garvey's my first master, so I ain't knocking him. I'm pointing out a contradiction, that even he suffered from mental slavery. And he supported World War I. His original name for his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association, had imperial in it. He took it out later. He realized he can't be pushing no imperialism. But there was still a model, a British model, that he was drawing from. That's why he dressed using the British, hat, and uniform, and saber, and all the rest of this stuff. So while he had some deep Black pride coming from his roots in Jamaica, he also had the contradiction of colonialism. And so it's only when he attends a meeting of Hubert Harrison, the Liberty League, that he begins, because he's ready to leave the United States because he wasn't able to connect with Blacks. And until he got into the mindset, in this case, the militant mindset of Blacks, he wouldn't be able to. And Hubert Harrison was himself from the West Indies, and he was one of the most brilliant Black people of that time, and played a big role in putting Garvey on the right track in terms of getting his newspaper together and a whole bunch of other things. But when he attended Hubert Harrison's meeting, he saw a different type of Black person. It was a radical anti-war Black person. These were returning World War I veterans who were angry at being used by the Black elite, W.B. Du Bois and others, who had told them to go and fight in World War I to make the world safe for democracy. That was the Woodrow Wilson's claim, and he was a racist Southerner. And, when they come back from the war, they realize that they're facing bloody summers. Whites are coming back from the war, and they find Blacks in neighborhoods that have formerly been white and in jobs that they held. And so there were bloody summers where Blacks were shooting back to defend themselves from white mobs. And so for the first time, Garvey comes in contact with the awakened Black person. At that time, we called him a Negro, the angry Black person, the anti-war Black person. And it is that sentiment that woke Garvey up. Garvey became anti-war. It's Black people who themselves had some been brainwashed to fight in the war and some didn't, who came back disillusioned and angry and were defending themselves against the mobs, something very similar to what you're facing right now. And so they transformed Garvey's consciousness. And when Garvey's consciousness was transformed to a militant anti-war consciousness, and he began to build his UNIA on that, streams of Black people began to come into his movement. And then Garvey could push his own self-reliance, push his own sense of nationhood, because the Garvey movement coming to the US and uniting with the African American was uniting race consciousness with this idea of independence, because though the people in Jamaica were a majority, they were not yet in control of that island. They were under colonialism, but they could see the future. And so Garvey operated like a head of state because he came out of that situation. And so it was a union of this idea of national independence, which some Blacks had in this country, but it was much stronger in the Caribbean, with race consciousness. And Garvey became race conscious. And when he became race conscious, then he tied into the mindset of the African American. And while race is an invention of white people, what forged African American culture in enslavement was a fact that we saw that what we had most in common was our Blackness. But that was the coating on the cake of new African culture, because within it are the principles that have been reworked in the African setting in the United States. And that's what is new African culture, but with contradictions. And I'm going to be focusing on the contradictions today. So Blyden's first critique was that not only the missionary project, but another project behind it was promoting mental slavery. And he was a Black man that didn't just read books, he transformed his mind. He didn't come with a plantation mentality that many Blacks who went to Liberia had. They built mansions and they oppressed the people, just the way white people did. They acted like the slave masters who they had said they were escaping from and going to Liberia. He didn't. He had an African state of mind, because if you're going to love yourself, you got to love Africa. The best features of Africa, not all things in Africa are positive. And we're not talking about going back to the past and just living in the past, but you got to take the best out of the past. And as the rappers say, go Black to the future, not B-A-C-K, B-L-A-C-K, Black to the future. And you say, oh, that ain't practical. Well, what is America? America is nothing but an exaggeration of Europe, particularly Britain. Its worst features, an exaggerated carbon copy. The only thing original about America, European Americans, is it's not original. That's hard to be a human being whose essence is supposed to be creativity and just be imitating, and then take it to its worst aspects. Look at the White House right now. Huh? If there's racism in Europe, and there certainly is, America took it to its extreme. If there's materialism in Europe, and there surely is, America took it to its raggedy extreme. And if there's violence in Europe, and of course the European was violent all over the world, this is one of the most violent places on the planet Earth. In fact, Jimmy Carter said it's the most violent, because he was standing on his little record that he didn't have a war during his time. So Blyden makes this comment that the problem is the problem of mental slavery. Africa still suffers from it, though it is awakened. It is waking up. Africans in America still suffer from it, though there is an awakening. And there's an awakening where people's eyes are opening up. And I can always tell by the comments. I'll make a comment about our power. And then someone will come back with a statement about how we don't have any power. Like that's supposed to be some profound wisdom. A roach has power, an ant has power, and you mean you don't have any? Then you don't know yourself. And I've often said this before. Our greatest weakness, the weakness of the African in America, not all, but too many, is we don't know our own strengths. We're so busy tabulating the weaknesses. And one of the indications of a slave mentality is negativity. The slave mentality is a negative mentality. No matter how positive something is, they're always focusing on the negative. That's been a part of the slave mentality. Not all enslaved had that. You couldn't come up with a song like, oh, freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord to be free. That's not a song sung by a slave. They're saying, before I'll be a slave. They're telling you, slave with, chains around the wrist, chains on the legs, but a free mind. There was a whole lot of Black people in enslavement that had free minds. And let me tell you, the key to that one is this. We've overworked this thing of self-hatred, and I'm getting into the slave mentality. So I'm doing both sides here. The overriding reason that Blacks could survive enslavement was their love of each other. And in fact, this extremely self-hating African was the exception rather than the rule. Some of them were slave breakers and slave drivers, but the overwhelming majority were not. I've discussed what Frederick Douglass said about the attitude that he had towards his brothers and sisters on, of all names, the freeland plantation, because they had what they called a good slave master. There were no good slave masters, but the one that only whipped you when you didn't really follow his rules. But he said, it was the love of my brothers and sisters that kept us going. The hardest thing to do in escaping from slavery was to leave behind your loved ones. He didn't say his mother because he only saw her once, but it was his extended family community. He said, we never did anything without talking to each other. That's contrary to the picture that you get. That song, Before I'll Be a Slave, that's the spirit of the enslaved African. Zora Neale Hurston said, the more African we were, it was because we were closer to slavery, in the sense that we were more African in slavery. But we carried out some aspects of mental slavery. So Blyden took this to another level. And this one is a hard pill for most Blacks to accept. Blyden said this. He said, mental slavery was worse than physical slavery. Mental slavery was worse than physical slavery. So I think most people would say, now that is going too far. That is going too far. How can you say that? Remember, this is one of the two best minds produced in the U.S. or the Caribbean, and a leading mind in Africa, the leader of the revolt against mental colonialism. So what did he mean by that? How could mental slavery, and this he's talking about after slavery, formal slavery, be worse than formal slavery? Can't nothing be worse than that, right? Huh? Now, what he meant was that the power that the European continued to wield after slavery, during colonialism, and in this country, semi-colonialism after 1876, that power was no different from the power they wielded over you during slavery, except that you usually weren't getting a whip. You might get in the United States a rope around your neck, But the key point is the same power that maintained slavery continued after slavery. Now, we already know part of the reason for this. In the Caribbean, when Africans received emancipation, they didn't receive any reparations. So they were in the same condition of poverty, but ain't no master providing no victuals at all, food, and they didn't provide hardly any when you were enslaved. So what they did is they delegated the oppression of Black people to Black people. Now, the one thing they had in the island was their land, but they didn't have the capital. They didn't have the resources to develop it. Read Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, and he's telling you how white people got rich off of us. And then you have knuckleheads like Bill Maher talking about he ain't giving no money for no reparations. He didn't do it. Really? Yeah, you actually are doing it because you're perpetuating mental slavery. You went and had dinner with Donald Trump talking about, why did Donald Trump invite you? Because he wanted to show there ain't no difference between the liberal and the conservative. By the way, that's my thing. I say this. The only difference between a liberal and a conservative is that they both have the same agreement in their attitude towards Blacks. But the difference is that the conservative is not only going to tell you what they're going to do, but they're going to do it. The liberal will tell you that they're opposed to it, but will do nothing to oppose it. That's the liberal. That's Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery. Now, the average Black person would translate that to mean he wanted to end slavery. No, the anti-slavery advocate was just opposed, but he was not for doing anything about it. That's how he got elected to president in 1860. The South was dumb to secede. And there's a whole nother history on that. You don't know the history on that. Because this is the US of A, United States, as Gore Vidal said, of amnesia. And we suffer from our own kind of amnesia imposed by enslavement. Because to the degree that we don't like Africa, it's to that degree that whites have created a negative image of Africa. And you bought that image. And so if you think, because here was the message drowned into our heads in enslavement: a savage in Africa, a slave in America. It took a couple of generations for that to sink into the heads of a lot of our people. I have been in homes where Black people come in saying, are they civilized over there yet? They're living in communities where people could be blown away watching TV and asking that. Are they civilized yet? And if you have that view of your roots, you'll have that view of your fruits. You hear me? So Blyden was saying that mental slavery was worse than physical slavery, in part because there's an illusion that you have that you're free. But you're under the same circumstances of enslavement that you were through slavery. What he was talking about when he was saying that mental freedom at this stage after slavery was worse than slavery is he was saying colonialism was worse than slavery in the sense that now, in the case of Africa and the Caribbean, foreigners have raised their flags with the Berlin Conference. They've cut the continent up and each taken their piece. And if you have any illusion of leadership, a chief, for example, who is still a chief, he's become the mouthpiece of the colonizer, not the mouthpiece of the people, because kings in Africa were not kings like kings in Europe, where they had unlimited power over the people. They had to speak for their council, and that council was responsible to the people. They came from lineage heads. In the case of Ghana, Akan, lineage heads. And these were the most just people at the lineage level, elders, wise elders. And they were first among equals in their lineage. All the males and females in the lineage made the decision. And that's the way it worked with kings. It was the best man who was the king, the most just, the most truthful, the most brave, the most respectful of women, you know, that was the one they picked, not somebody that had some campaign slogan. You hear me? Best man. Whereas the European kings were the worst men. They were the ones who killed their way, slashed and cut their way to the top, did whatever they wanted to do, and completely unqualified to do anything, and certainly had no sense of right. So Blyden was saying that mental slavery was worse than physical slavery because now, under colonialism, what you had was a system of power where the European came in, they came in with guns. It was no longer just Bibles. And the best gun they had was the Maxim gun. That was a machine gun. And that was why we were conquered. But when we draw from Africa, we have to be proud of this. 100 years Africa fought this invasion, 100 years. They went into certain parts of the world and just wiped everybody out. And they committed genocide in certain parts of Africa, but they didn't do it in the whole because they couldn't. You hear me? There was the resistance of Shaka in Zululand with his Zulu discipline, where soldiers didn't wear shoes because Shaka said it slowed them down. And when they got into engage an enemy, they had this asigi, which was a spear that was a stabbing spear, so that it was no longer throwing a spear, it was killing somebody. And yeah, that wasn't equal to a gun, and they got some guns, but not enough. But they actually broke the British square. And the British square was a system where one, because they had these single loading breech lock weapons, where you had to put in a bullet, you know, had to put it in and all this kind of stuff, so that they would have one rank shooting, the other was reloading, and then they'd shoot, the other was reloading, and they would shoot. It was continuous fire. And it was set to Wales at the Battle of Islandawa that wiped out the British square. And so when we're looking at Africa, we can be proud of the fact that the Mahdi in North Africa, in the Sudan, led the resistance against Chinese Gordon, who was a drug dealer, a general from Britain that had dealt opium in China. They sliced his head off. You had the resistance movements in West Africa, Samurai Touré, which was Sekou Touré's relative, who was using guerrilla warfare to fight the whites. And then you have Ya Asantewaa coming out of the Asante people in Ghana, leading the last resistance, and of course in Zinga before that. So it was no rollover. The reason why they got Africa was technique, meaning gunpowder. And that's why they're losing today, because those techniques are in everybody's hands. And you may say, we don't all have atom bombs. Well, the U.S. had an atom bomb or atom bombs in Vietnam. Did it help them win? Huh? They had it in Korea. Did it help them win? They had it in Iraq and Afghanistan. America is going down the tube. Brother Ibrahim Traoré made this point. Power relationships are shifting in the world. That's why we could have a successful Black freedom, Black power, Black Panther, Pan-Africanist, Afrocentric set of movements that didn't just put us in motion, but put white youth in motion, put Chicanos in motion, put Puerto Ricans in motion, put Native Americans in motion. You got power, baby. You just better know what it is and how to wield it. So as we talk about this slave mentality, understand there's another side. And that side is the awakened African. And when you love Africa, know yourself, know your history, and engage yourself in struggle, then you be on that side. That's your choice. So this is the point that Blyden was making, that there was this problem of mental slavery. In the United States, how did this work? I've mentioned this before, but I want to tie this in a different way, and most of you haven't heard this. as the Hayes-Tilden Compromise settles in, which is, we're in this second phase of it that started in 1968, where the gains that we made in the 60s, they're trying to roll them back. And it starts with Nixon in 1968. So this is what Trump is trying to do right now. I'm going to really stress this. There's 70 million of us. We're all over the place. We make up, along with the Latinos, 50% of the military. You can get rid of the four-star generals like Brown all you want. We're in it, baby. And we know how to fight. And so you think you're just going to go and roll over us? This ain't rock and roll, baby. This is rhythm and blues. This is the blues. So what we got to understand is that we're in a different situation now. So part of that situation was 1945, when you had Africans gathering together at the Fifth Pan-African Congress. This is a meeting of many of the leaders of Africa in the 60s. In the background, the brother who's smiling is Julius Nyerere with his head bent down. The person next to him is Milton Obote, then head of Uganda. And then the president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda. In front of him is Haile Selassie, and to his left side is Jomo Kenyatta and other leaders of Africa. And then the most despicable one of all, in the front row to the right, is Mobutu, a killer among killers, the greediest among the greediest. But the point is, these are Africans who were a part of Africa's independence movement, and some of them produced great things. The one I'm going to focus on is Julius Nyerere. Julius Nyerere, right here, a brother who I had the pleasure of meeting in 1977. This is Nyerere working in the Ujamaa villages right there with his hat on. This is a village leader in Tanzania when Pan-African People's Organization, which I chair, went to Tanzania and worked in the Ujamaa villages for 3 months. And this leader said, if anyone calls any member of this African-American delegation Negroes, I'm putting them in jail. And we had an African dance troupe that danced, but the people wanted to see the boogaloo. They wanted to see the funky Broadway. You know what I mean? They want to see the dances we're doing now. This is a meeting at our headquarters, Malcolm X Unity House. To the left, the woman on the far left, that's Ella Hill Hutch, the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, the person that got me involved in the movement, my mother's best friend. The tall, dark complexioned brother there with the dark coat on, that is Bomani, who was ambassador from Tanzania to the United States. And we were then preparing for the Sixth Pan-African Congress. And then a young child and a sister, and then my wife, my first wife, Oba T'Shaka, and then the person there that you see profile, that's me. So we were meeting with the ambassador of Tanzania to discuss the strategies that we would employ at the Sixth Pan-African Congress, Africans working to unify Africa. This is me meeting with the ambassador, that's me with the big natural, the ambassador from China. And to his side is our representative in Tanzania. His name is Simba Tayari. He'll probably watch this show. He made comments on the last one. And this is a brother who is a member of Pan-African People's Organization. And there I was asking the Chinese, why were they giving guns to Mobutu? They said, well, if they come from them, they're revolutionary guns. Oh, they're like hell. You're in there for the wealth, you know? This is one of the liberation movements in Africa, Zimbabwe African National Union. And our organization, Pan-African People's Organization, led African Liberation Day for about 5 years in the Bay Area, averaging 25 to 30,000 people each year. We sent all kinds of supplies to the armed struggles, including ZANU. And one of our members was a member of ZANU, Kambori Kangai, who was then a medical student at UC San Francisco, would later graduate, become a doctor, and go back to Zimbabwe, and was the second most influential person in the government of Zimbabwe. This is me meeting with ZANU leaders, to appraise them of our struggle in the States, and for them to appraise us of their situation and what they needed and how we could support them as a people. And this brother who's up front with the big natural, that's a brother named Ajili Hodari, who was one of the leaders in Pan-African People's Organization. This brother here had played football at Michigan State, and then had tried out for the Dallas Cowboys. And when he didn't make it, he had a little money. He stayed in the Bay Area. We recruited him in the Pan-African People's Organization. Ajili, I named him. It means sharp-minded. He went back to the University of Michigan, got a law degree, raised some children, one, an engineer who went to West Point, another, a doctor, another, a architect, another, a science person that deals with computers, and got them advanced degree from Harvard. Went to Stanford, went to Harvard. This guy's real smart and a real good organizer, good brother, And this is, of course, the Chwa people, the Kun people who gave birth to humanity. So what I want to do is go back and keep this focus on Julius Nyerere. So how did mental enslavement work in the United States? So you had colonialism reinforcing the power, really the basis of the power of the Europeans that occupied Africa. That would enforce some kind of compliance, a certain amount of submissiveness to white power, because they had the guns at your head. No place were we facing more of a threat to our survival than the United States, where we were not a majority on the land, though in certain places like Mississippi we were, and therefore we faced the greatest terrorism. So how did mental slavery work in the United States? Now, there's a lot of levels to this. And by the way, my book, Seba and Sodaya, that will be out soon, is the Free the Mind system at the educational level, right? But not just for schools, but for communities, for families, for every level of society. It's a shift. It's a replacement from their system of miseducation. But what happens in 1876? Blacks are put into a condition of new enslavement. And this new enslavement is a new form of slavery called sharecropping. So the problem for the people running the country was, how are you going to get blacks to go along with this? And so there was a conference held, and we owe this to Dr. Jacob Carruthers, who was the first to do research on this. And then I've gone in and looked at this and come up with a spin of my own, but he was the first one to tell us about this, the Mohonk Conference. And this was a conference chaired by the previous president of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, the one who withdrew federal troops from the South, the one who put 2 Supreme Court justices from the South on the Supreme Court to dismantle the Civil Rights Bill that had already been passed. And there's been a dismantling of the enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Bill. But don't assume that you haven't got any power. It's weakened you, but if you organize right, you can still win at the electoral arena, though that's not the main arena of struggle. It's the streets, and the main battle is for our minds. And so they held a series of conferences called the Mohonk Conferences in the 1890s. A number of them were on Native Americans because they had wiped out 90% And so the question was, how would they control the other 10%? And it was basically a program of cultural genocide, of replacing Native American culture with European American culture. And so we know about the boarding schools, at least you should, where Native American kids were brought into these schools, and they did everything to strip them of their languages and to instill in them a white mindset of servility. But they are coming back. That ain't worked. You understand? Native Americans are going back to their native languages, and have been in resistance from the time they've been in this country, and they have been our best allies. I was privileged to be in the Black Hills in 1984 with the American Indian Movement. Minister Farrakhan was there to support them in their move to reclaim the Black Hills and get the whites out of there, because they're taking the uranium and then poisoning the people with it. And Russell Means had called this meeting. And Russell Means was a beautiful brother. Later, he refused to call himself a leader because among his people, that wasn't really how they approached people who are taking any kind of position to stand up for their people. So in the post-Reconstruction period, the 1890s, this Mohawk Conference is held, and Rutherford B. Hayes is presiding over it. But the leading presentation at the Mohawk Conference was given by General Armstrong. General Armstrong was president of Hampton Institute, and his best student was Booker T. Washington. So his address is the key address. He said this: the problem with the Negro is he doesn't want to work. See, we've been worked to death in enslavement. And then when there's emancipation, we don't get 40 acres. We don't get a mule. We certainly don't get any reparations. Huh? And for a while, we got the right to vote. It had been taken away in the South. And so this was a meeting of philanthropists. This was a meeting of miseducators, a few missionaries, And so the question was, how are you going to get the Negro to work when he doesn't want to? And Armstrong was honest in his presentation. He said, it's understandable why. Because we forced them to work for nothing. You know what I mean? Now they are meeting to get us back to work for nothing, under the disguise of sharecropping, because sharecropping was nothing but new slavery. And so the question is, how can we use a system of mental slavery to re-enslave the Black mind, who is now technically free of shackles, but we still got all the power, as was the case in Africa, except it's worse, because now Blacks had become slaves of every white person. That's how Frederick Douglass described it. And the reality is slaves of the states. So if you're walking around and you're not enslaved on a plantation, they'll throw you in prison. And if you don't get off the street and grin at some little white kid or white person, you can be lynched. Or you can be shot for no reason. So if we're going to understand how mental slavery after slavery was worse than slavery, then you better understand the conditions that you were under before you were under an individual master. And he was brutal often, sometimes not, but he was brutal in the sense that he was keeping you under his control, keeping you often away from your family, and working you to the bone. But at least every white person couldn't come on the plantation and do whatever they wanted to you. But after slavery, every white person saw themselves as the master. And some white people still have that attitude today. I'm watching some pictures on Facebook where these white boys are coming in. There was one real nice picture there where one brother is defending himself against two white boys, and he cleans them both out, cleans one out, and then he falls down. He goes after the other, and the other one gets up, cleans him out again, and then he runs. And then another one where the white boy is stripped to his waist. He knows a little martial arts, he's taking his little posture and stuff. It's a tall young brother, and he's insulting the brother in every possible way. And the brother doesn't want to fight. He's backing off, but it's not because he's afraid. And finally, one insult too many, the brother takes his jacket off, throws it on the ground. His girlfriend comes and picks up the jacket. I don't know if you've seen this on Facebook. And then he proceeds to knock the white boy out and stomp on him and then walk away. These are the days you're dealing with now. It's not too different from before. But the point is, when the brother was saying that mental slavery was worse than physical slavery, so now we're in a situation where whites have got the power. But the problem is they got to get the black person to go along willingly to work for them. And so this is Armstrong's point. His point is, we must find a way to get blacks to work for us willingly. In other words, a willing slave. You never had one of those before, huh? How are you going to do this? Huh? And I think you should remember Ibrahim Traoré's remarks about the psychological methods that have been used by the European. And he said they're still in effect. And he's somebody that's broke through those chains so he can see it. Malcolm had broke through those chains so he could see it. And so this is re-enslavement of the mind. And so how did they propose to do this? By training 3 leadership groups: preachers, teachers, and new elders. I don't know if Jake had got that one. New elders. Why new elders? Because one of the institutions that survived in the United States, and many African institutions did, was the institution of eldership. And that's who we consulted almost always before making group decisions. We would consult the elders because that's what they did in Africa, but that's where you get the best advice. We weren't bound to go by that advice, but we usually would. And so you had elders in this period who had peeped the big game. What was the big game of Armstrong? Armstrong's big game was industrial education. That was Hampton Institute's educational program. There's a book that Booker T. Washington wrote I didn't know anything about. But Aubrey LeBrie, who's passed on to the other side, a beautiful brother, a lawyer, a former member of the Afro-American Association, founder of Black Dialogue magazine, a conscious Black magazine, that I wrote an article on the Black Freedom Movement in San Francisco in their first edition. I have a copy of it. He let me go into his place where he had stored things because he's getting older and moved into a smaller space. And so one of the books I got, I never knew existed. It didn't have a cover on it. Written by Booker T. Washington. What was the title? Work. That was the philosophy of Hampton Institute. That was the curriculum of Hampton Institute. Work. They were training people to be teachers, to teach Black people the value of working for white people who would give you nothing in return. Of course, they would promise you that you get something at the end of the year, but at the end of the year, you ended up owing. And if you left and you got caught, you could be lynched. That was sharecropping. That was new slavery. But in order to get Black people to do this, they had to get us to submit to this. So they wanted to train teachers in what they called industrial education. There was no industry in it because Blacks were frozen out of the industrial work in the North. And there was no real education in it of substance. It was about work. That's all Armstrong taught was work, 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 work. You didn't need to be taught work. That's why blacks were against it, working for somebody else, enriching somebody else. You getting nothing out of the labor. You understand? So they needed teachers that could propagate this. These were called representative men of color and women, but largely men at that point, who took on the values of whites. And the foremost value of whites is to be a good, upright citizen and work. By the way, that's your philosophy of education today. I know conscious nationalists who think the role of education is to prepare you for a job. You are a fool if you think that. Huh? They brought you here to work from can see to can't see. The purpose of education is for you to know yourself. The purpose of education is for you to be your best self. That's the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to free your mind so you can engage in a struggle of liberation for your people. That is the role of education. And even African-centered education is sufficient, but is necessary, but not sufficient if it doesn't break free of the pedagogy of the Western system. Because Carter G. Woodson's critique of this was, in Miseducation of the Negro, his critique was, for taught the same history, philosophy, social systems, whatnot of the European, our mind has been brought under control. And he said, in the era of segregation, you didn't have to tell a miseducated black person to go to the back seat. They would go on their own. And he said, if there was not a back seat, they would make one. Huh? That was his critique. And that was a critique of what this general was trying to accomplish with industrial education. And even those that went into classical education, most of them were taking the attitude of, I don't need to be teaching that black mess. I don't need to be teaching about Africa. And so when Carter G. Woodson wrote Miseducation of the Negro, he's talking about the highly miseducated Negro. And he's saying basically they are on remote control because they have internalized someone else's system. What Carter G. Woodson didn't get, and what my book on Seba and Sodaya goes into in great depth, is because at his time he couldn't realize that the method of education, what's called pedagogy, how you teach, is as important a roadblock in freeing the mind if you're teaching using the wrong method as the misinformation is. You have to be able to break free of both. So if you're using their method to teach and you're giving them African-centered education, you will end up with the same results. You need to read the book when it comes out. I ain't going into what that is. You have to read the book. I'm providing a new system for truly educating our people, not just in the classroom, but in the community, in the family, where often we get our best teachings, and in the universe, in the world, because the classroom is much bigger than the four rooms. As Nathan Harris said, the community is the classroom. That was my classroom. That's where I underwent my real awakening. It wasn't in any university. So this project, which was to train teachers and preachers. Now, why do they want to train? So the teachers, they wanted them to teach the European methods and basically subservience, teach their history, teach their culture, teach their politics. But don't be teaching anything about your history and your culture. Don't be talking about freeing any minds. That's one. And what they were teaching was to despise your own people, and particularly your people's history. So the teacher, that was the assignment. Now, not all Black teachers fell for that. A lot of Black teachers under segregation, whatever amount of education they had, they used it to uplift Black children. John Henry Clark talks about the Black women in his life, his grandmother, who transmitted the knowledge of Africa to him, about Buck, her husband, his grandfather. that he was somebody that didn't take any mess from white people. And then one of his teachers who took him into the lunchroom where she was eating, is really her office. And John said he was beginning to act the clown. He was following peer pressure, which now a lot of our youth are doing. And she had him look her straight in the eye. And she said, I don't want you acting the fool anymore. She said, if you have to go in life by yourself, then following a fool, it's better to be by yourself. And then she told him she expected great things from him. And John said, that carried me a long way in my life. You understand? So, and many of these good Black teachers, some of them didn't have university education. And on the other hand, we had some of the most highly educated Blacks because the only job they could get was teaching, PhDs in high school. Mathematicians, if you look at the people, those sisters who did the whole math for the space program, they were trained by geniuses. So this project wasn't a total success, but it certainly had its effect. And so the teacher was designed to do that. They wanted to create a new elder. Now this, you got to really be out of your mind, but it shows that they were at least realizing what was going on. They wanted to create an elder program by them. Well, elder by definition means someone who's wise, not just old, wise. And it was a wise elder, and there were many of them who were pulling the coats of a lot of Blacks who were being lined up for miseducation. And one way they did it, and it was in these papers on the Mohawk Conference, they said, and they said this to whites too, who are advocates of the Mohawk Conference until they got to them and flipped them. He said, well, if industrial education is so good, why is it only for us? One white woman who spoke at the Mohawk Conference said that. She was becoming converted to anti-industrial education because industrial education was just a guise for getting you to work for white people. This book that Booker T. Washington wrote on work, that book was about using self-reliance to undermine the philosophy that he was taught at Hampton. And while he tommed on politics, behind the scenes, he financed movements to oppose segregation. In the front, he was acting like he was supporting it. But if you look at Tuskegee, it was built by Blacks. They made every brick. They had their own floor plans, the whole thing. And his whole idea was to break this mold of you becoming just a sharecropper to get you into business, to become economically self-reliant. That's what inspired Garvey when he came here. And Booker T is not a hero of mine. I know Booker T sent people to the Congo to aid Leopold in the Congo, who was chopping off hands if you didn't bring in enough rubber or whatever. You understand? So he has many sides, and he's not a hero of mine. But he also saw the predicament Blacks were in, and he tried to do something with Tuskegee. And the best thing he did was bring in George Washington Carver, the baddest scientist in the history of the world up to that time. His only competition would be Imhotep. You hear me? That would be the only competition he'd have. That was one beautiful brother. You hear me? So, and then going back to the preacher. The people at the Mohawk Conference had a view of Christianity among Blacks very different from ours. We think that Blacks embraced slavery, embraced Christianity during slavery. The majority did not. The overwhelming majority, Du Bois has the exact numbers, a couple of 100,000 Blacks who were Christians at the end of slavery out of 8 or 9 million Blacks who were not. And when blacks embrace Christianity, they do it on their own terms. Unlike the missionary project in Africa, blacks drop their culture into the black church. And that is, what is that? Voodoo. And that's what they say at the Mohawk conference. They said, what these blacks are preaching out here and practicing out here, this ain't Christianity. Huh? The black psychologists call it the voodoo in our IQ. The whole church, or the black church, was structured to bring about possession, the singing of the spirituals or the gospel blues of Thomas Dorsey, that Mahalia Jackson and James Cleveland introduced into the black church, is designed to induce, as the sister said, gospel. Sing a song and put a spell on you. How? Through repetition. Huh? And what was the messages they were given? See, blacks were smart. Where did they have to meet after slavery? This was new slavery. Oh, they could put up a church. But it was a free African society, a secret society that did that. Huh? And they were using this for what? James Smalls says, who comes out of South Carolina, they had, wailing benches where you would go to be possessed before you could enter the church. And they had other institutions that were the entry to the black church, praise houses. There were more praise houses in the South than churches. Praise houses come out of Africa. Praise, baby. They would bring out a statue full of a spirit in Kemet, and then they would do praise to it. That's what Africans were practicing. And that's what happens when the Pentecostal church is founded. And listen to Doc Ben. When he gives you your stuff on African religion, it's his best book. He's talking about how in the Pentecostal church, blacks are doing the same thing. They're doing it voodoo. That's why I'm in the spiritual blues. My mother and father, they were not churchgoers. Neither was I that much. But they would take me to these holiness churches when I was a kid. And it was the beauty of that moaning, those beautiful sounds that you heard there with Old Freedom, the blues sounds and gospel music. Oh, I love that. You hear me? To this day, because beauty is what drives our culture. As Ibrahim Traoré said, we took ugliness and turned it into beauty. And in fact, when we had the great artist Dewey Crumpler on, you should go watch his stuff. He was talking about Monk and how Monk had a saying of ugly beauty. Monk played a piano like it was a drum. But what he was saying is, we came into a situation of ugliness and we created beauty out of it. And that's what we're doing to this day. And whenever you see a black person that puts money before their people, they're putting ugliness first. You ever see a person like Snoop Doggy Dogg having the nerve when in the first election, 2016, he called Trump out, said anybody that voted for him was selling out. But once they get his boy from Death Row Records out of jail, who probably needed to stay in jail, he's talking about, Trump didn't do anything to me. He got my best friend out, and then he's up there doing a buck dance, at the ball that was held before the inauguration, the crypto ball. And you can bet he got him some crypto money. And so you're satisfied in getting a few dollars when your people, they're making an effort to put your people back in slavery. And guess what? They'll do the same thing that they did to the Jews in the Warsaw ghettos, who lined the Jews up. They were the ones that wore uniforms to line the Jews up to get on the trains that would take them to the concentration camps. When they took all of them, they stuck them on. So if you think your buck dancing is getting you anywhere, or Umar Johnson up here talking crap about let us avoid this election, and you're contributing to the oppression of your own people, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're a traitor to your own people. So what we have to understand is that this mental slavery was being carried in a new way through a new method. So in this particular case, they wanted their own elders. It didn't work at all. Because Black people are looking for good advice. And how do you create a new elder? You stomped all over the people. Who are you going to find to perform that role? The people pick those who they seek advice from. That fell completely flat. The institution of elderhood has been weakened since the mid-'80s because of drugs being put in our community and a drive to sow division between the young and the old, creating fear in the hearts of many of the old because of the violence put in the hands of the young by the CIA, who admits they did it. And do our leaders say anything about it? No. Silent on it. Point the finger at the victim. Yeah, we got violence in Black communities. It was violence put in there. Whole train loads of guns put into, railway stations so people could go pick them up. Where do you think they came from? They certainly didn't come from any Black gangsters. So the problems we got now of a choice between two cultures where some of us are stepping outside of our culture is because some of our people, some of our youth has been discarded, thrown in jail for things that white people do and don't get arrested for, smoking some marijuana. That ain't as bad for you as a cigarette. When the use of drugs among whites and Blacks is about the same, but is it the same incarceration rate? Hell no. So this is a new kind of mental slavery. And in this kind of slavery, anything goes. Where stuff is upside down in Black communities, it's going to take somebody with some real psychological understanding to get this stuff right. You hear me? So this was the plan. The majority of Black people were not working on plantations because they wanted to. They were trapped in a situation where violence kept them there. And when they could, they'd steal away at night the same way they did in slavery. My great grandmother, who was the mother of my grandmother, Catherine Filardi, she was a big, tall, thin, tough Black woman. They called her a wampus cat because she could beat a man or a woman. She slipped out of Mississippi in the dead of night. That's how they got out. Mississippi, one of the worst hellholes ever conceived in the imagination of demons. My grandmother talked about how they would take Black people, and this is after slavery, dig a hole and stick them in there and bury them up to their necks, put honey on their face so the ants could eat them alive. And Mississippi has not changed. America has not changed either. What has to change is your mind, your consciousness. So this was part of the program. And it was to create an elite that would be subservient to the system. And to some extent, that elite is intact to some extent. The Congressional Black Caucus, where have you heard them say anything serious about what's going on right now? Neoliberalism, they have been there with their hands out getting the cash, as some preachers have been doing. So this thing of mental slavery is key. Now I want to wrap this up with a discussion of Julius Nyerere and the system for freeing the mind that grew out of the 60s, both in Africa, the United States, and other parts of the world. Julius Nyerere, whose picture you see right there, is one of the two greatest leaders of Africa in the 20th century, the other Kwame Nkrumah. These two were visionaries. Julius Nyerere was a believer in Pan-Africanism. He said that he would forestall the independence of Tanzania, waiting on Kenya to become independent so they could join together as one nation. as the three nations have done with Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso and the adjoining nations. But Kenya did not want to do that. What was important about Nyerere? While Nyerere was a Catholic and had been exposed to that, as Nkrumah had been exposed to Christianity, Nyerere was raised in village life until he was 12 or 13 years old. He was inculcated with village values. He appreciated the traditional African system, the same system that Edward Wilmot Blyden advocated. And I haven't gone into what he advocated. That's for another time. And so, though he was university trained and everything else, he had the free mind of an African. This is the key to Nyerere. And so, when Nyerere comes to power, there are two phases of what he puts into motion called Ujamaa villages, Ujamaa, which means sharing through the family. It is a Swahili word for communalism, where the land, air, and water is not owned by individuals, but shared. And so there were two phases of Ujamaa. One was in the 60s, one was in the 70s. We worked in the villages in the 70s. But in the 60s, the Wananchi, which is the term in Swahili for grassroots Africans, they took up the call for Ujamaa. And they began to organize themselves into villages. And these villages provided education, free medical care, housing, and of course, agricultural production. And then out of this, the capital that could be developed could take them to the next level, which was industrialization of a form. This was the first phase. This was carried by the people. The people heard what Nyerere said and moved on it on their own. This was done in by people around Nyerere. In 1977, as I said, I met with Nyerere for about 3 hours outside his home with Simba Tayari, who was our representative in Tanzania, and my first wife, Oba T'Shaka. I took no notes on that. I can tell you everything we said. My wife had had a dream 10 years before that I'd meet Nyerere, and I have a briefcase in this office. It's a hand-tooled Mexican briefcase that I got in Mexico in the early 70s. And my wife, my first wife, said, Nyerere wanted your briefcase. But that was a symbol. So I didn't know if he wanted a briefcase because it was beautiful. In Africa, people want something, you're supposed to give it because it's a giving society. But when I met Nyerere, I realized that it was what was in the briefcase. I've never met a person that I had more agreement with, and a humble person, but nobody's joke, a tough person. And so Nyerere made this comment that on the independence of Tanzania, he had to prove that Africans could run their own country. So he didn't bring in any whites, except when he had a problem with his army. And then he brought in the whites, and then he retooled his army. And then he had an army that was completely loyal to him. But other than that, he wanted to prove that blacks could run their own society. And then he was telling me the problems that he had with the blacks who were running that society. He said, they are most opposed to you, the African from America, because they have been miseducated. They have a slave mindset. That's not what he said. I'm saying that that's why, They had a contempt for their own people, so it wasn't a contempt for us, it was a fear of us. They thought that we were coming in with skills and we would replace them. We wouldn't. We're not citizens of the country, right? So I was going there to get Tanzania to adopt a information center project, set up an information center in Tanzania to educate Africans on what we're doing here, and we could be educated on what was going on there and share it with our people. And we brought money. We stuck it in a bank. And we had a chapter of of Pan-African People's Organization in Tanzania. Mzee Robertson and his wife, she was the chair. Mzee Robertson had a degree in pharmacology. He led the University of Pharmacology in Dar es Salaam, But that was sabotaged by that elite. Nyerere gave us office space, everything else, but it didn't go anywhere because of that elite. But that elite in the 60s sabotaged Ujamaa. So in the 70s, when we came, we did not know that there was a Ujamaa program launched in the 60s. We didn't know that. I only found that out when CLR James White came here to speak 5 or 6 years ago. Danny Glover was on the panel. And I found out, oh, there had been a first Ujamaa. Huh? So what happened is, as we worked these villages, and I took notes on this, in one of my books, I'll talk about this in my writing, we worked in all kinds of Ujamaa villages all over Tanzania. We worked in the ones that are the real rough ones to work in, where they grow tobacco. The tobacco crop requires a kind of individual kind of farming. It's rough, and it's hard to keep people in line in terms of Ujamaa, but we worked there. We worked in all kinds of agricultural villages, and we saw people beginning to set aside money from the profits they made from their crops, so that they could move to the next level of bringing in industrialization. And then we went into their schools. You would have 100 kids in one classroom. You could hear a pin drop. The students were that serious. And these were teachers that would normally want to teach in urban areas, teaching in rural areas, and doing very well. Love for knowledge, And so we're there in 73. I go back a number of times and meet Nyerere in 77. And then in 84, the last time I was in Tanzania, I meet with the highest ranking African-American in Tanzania. And he's giving me a report. And it's the same thing that happened in the 60s. These villages have now grown. They have really produced. And they're on the verge of takeoff. They want to do some industrialization. You say you shouldn't do it. You should do solar energy. Well, at that point, it would have been industrialization. Later on, solar energy. But the point is, they were ready to move forward. And what was happening? Nyerere's people around him were sabotaging this. They were accusing this people of being capitalist roaders, of working against socialism. And they were disbanding the villages. Can you imagine? You have produced some freedom for your people, and you're going to put them back into a neo-colonial slavery. Nyerere was outvoted, and this was his mistake. His mistake was that thinking that he needed these mentally enslaved Africans to run the agricultural policies. They were trained in Britain and the United States or wherever they were, in literature, in art, in Shakespeare, in stuff you didn't need. They didn't know swat about agriculture, even though they grew up in agricultural villages. They had a disrespect for it because now they weren't going to use their hands to do anything. They were going to sit behind a desk and veto some of the best things that you could do, because they didn't believe in Africa, because in the brainwashing of psychological slavery, there's a belief that only white people can handle anything. We had a Simba Tayari who worked in the economic division, member of PAPO. He spoke Swahili fluently, and he gave me an example of this. He's working in an economic project, and his boss, who's, Tanzanian, asked him, "Do you need a white person to help you?" And he said, "No." And the guy goes, "Oh, really? You can do this by yourself?" Because the psychological dependency complex believes that you're not capable of doing this on your own. This has been put into your head. So they believe that these Africans who were building up villages agriculturally couldn't do what they were doing and dismantled it. Psychological slavery. Nyerere's mistake was to allow them to have any say-so in this and to even put anything that had to do with the villages to a vote. It was a mistake. And he should have put Wananchi, people who were the best farmers, who built the best villages, put them in charge. Let them run the show. And probably his best thing would have been to have them in other departments so that these brainwashed, psychologically enslaved Negroes wouldn't sabotage everything else that Nyerere was trying to do. So I'm not saying that to say that Africa's in bad shape. I'm saying that what Ibrahim Traoré is dealing with, he knows what he's facing. He's doing rapid industrialization, rapid modernization, over 22 projects that he's carrying out, over 22, you know, and in every area, controlling as much as they can the agriculture because everything else depends on agriculture. So they have businesses where they're packaging their agricultural products. People can buy them in the country or selling those that don't need to be packaged. He's got advanced methods for banking. He's taken the gold that normally would be controlled by France and every penny, dime, nickel, whatever, is being put into production. Tractors, factories. They actually built a car in Burkina Faso, an electric car. And Elon Musk had the nerve to come and without any advisors or anything else, try and scam Ibrahim Traoré. And Ibrahim didn't even bring in an advisor and tell them, no, get out of here. So it's development all over the place, free education from elementary school through university, $150 a month for students, which is a lot in Africa. You know, taking the judges out of these freaky robes and these white wigs and putting on traditional dress. That's just the surface level of trying to change the mentality of the legal system. And he's saying, as Nyerere was dealing with Ujamaa, we need to end private property. And of course, this will bother some of you. Private property, oh, you mean I can't have my house? You know what I mean? One of the worst things that the European brought into the world was this notion of private property. As long as, by that I mean that the land, air, and water could be individually owned. And imagine owning air. Huh? And look at, you're buying bottled water. Do you know that water's been tapped out so much in the country that you've got water crisis going on around the United States where there's not enough water to take care of the needs of the people? And so he's thinking about how can we restructure a system where you don't have the land, air, and water in the hands of individuals, because in the end, it ends up in the hands of very few people. 1% of this country controls well over 50% of the wealth. One person in this country, Elon Musk, has more wealth than most of the population in the world. And that's why you have hunger. And that's the crime. Capitalism is a crime. Because I know you don't want to hear that, some of you. But capitalism was based on slavery and genocide. And so it makes the rich rich and the poor poorer. And so what you have going on in Africa now is an awakening because they freed their mind. And I want to conclude on this one. Nyerere had a free mind because he came out of a situation where he was raised by his own people in a village culture, and therefore he saw African culture as being something that you could draw from as a basis for building a free society. The 60s provided an answer for the question of how we free the minds of the masses of Black people. It didn't come from a book. It didn't come from ancient Africa, though you had to return to the source of your history and culture to really free the mind. The system itself was organic. I went through this system. Malcolm X went through this system. Amilcar Cabral, who is right behind me there, you know, that yellow picture in the background, he went through this system. And those Blacks that really underwent deep transformation went through this system, because if you followed the truth, and at that time we didn't call it Ma'at, but it was the truth, you'll end up there. It's an organic system. It means it's like it grows out of the ground. And so it has stages of development. And so Cabral was able to free his mind. He made the decision to be African by going through this process. His started in a study group in Africa, where these assimilated-minded, Portuguese-trained, miseducated Africans were undergoing re-education through study groups. And he said, we made the decision to be African. And so he was transforming out of the assimilated mindset into an African mindset. Malcolm's initiation began in prison, where in the end, he experienced more freedom in prison than he had ever experienced before, though had he listened to his mother and father, who were Garveyites, you know, he wouldn't have had to go through that. And I want to note that the people who woke Malcolm up was his own family, who had not been assimilated, at least into the level of white identity. They had probably other issues, but they were conscious enough to wake him up. In my case, my initiation came through battles. That led me to the books. But the key thing to mental freedom is freeing your mind so you can think for yourself, so you see yourself through your own eyes. And that's a liberating experience. It's a Seba experience. And when you have that experience, you know your mind was captured before and you didn't know it. As Malcolm said, it would be like your mind was like a basketball and they're dribbling down the court and making shots and you don't even know where your mind is gone. You think that you were smart. You were smart at regurgitating what others had taught you, repeating what others had said. But you didn't see the truth for yourself. And so it's this Free the Mind, 6-fold stages to mental freedom, which is going to be put in a separate book. I have it in The Integration Trap. I have it in The Art of Leadership, Volume 2. But in a systematic form, it's going to come in a book form that I've done but haven't completed, and it'll probably take a year to refine that. And that will be our gift to Africa and to people of color, because, by the way, the assimilation process doesn't just affect us. And this is the thing that will enable you to go to the depths of true freedom and true creativity. And it will probably end a lot of problems that you have, like the stress that causes high blood pressure and all this stuff. I know a lot of conscious Black people who are just as physically ill as the unconscious. And that means that there's some recesses in their mind that they need to still work on, because it's stress that usually is knocking Black people out. But if you're conscious and you're awake, you cause stress. You do it even when it's unintentional. My birthday, my wife, Pam, arranged a thing with one of my former students, Venus Nobles, who is a lovely lady. We went out to dinner in Sausalito, which is a very beautiful place. real beautiful, right on the ocean and stuff. So it was a real pleasure to sit with her. And she's an Afrocentric Christian, by the way, and quite conscious. And so she made this comment because at San Francisco State, I taught there 40 years. And during that time, I always organized right after class. I spent more time organizing than teaching and writing and stuff. And she was talking about the president of San Francisco State. There's a guy named Ken Montero that watches this show, so he'll affirm this fact. She said, the president of San Francisco State, he's passed on now, his name was Corrigan, Robert Corrigan. He tried to wipe us out. And I led the campaign that whipped him. And then after whipping him, I don't have whites in my house, except if it's PG&E, that's the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, or something like that. But I told my dean, I want a meeting with Corrigan in my house. Oh no, he held off for a year. I found out later because the president was still trying to get him to do us in. Phil McGee, one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever known, one of the 4 leaders of the Black psychology movement. He was Wade Noble's teacher, you know? He was holding off. He didn't tell me why until later. You know, they were pressuring him to do the same stuff that they tried to do and couldn't do, you know? But when you whip an opponent, you're supposed to get the benefits. Now, you call it reparations. There ain't no reparations. I mean, this is just what you're entitled to. So finally, I got him to the house. And I had the other chairs of the department there and everything else. I'm telling you this to tell you how power works and how you relieve stress. In fact, you shouldn't have hardly any, because stress is largely controlled by a power relationship where you're out. You don't have control over the situation. You got to be in control. But if you believe in white supremacy, you've automatically locked yourself in to what the psychologists call, Wade Nobles calls it, conceptual incarceration. You're imprisoned by your fears, and that causes the high blood pressure and all the rest of this stuff. So I made a point of having him there an hour before the other chairs came. Asian American, Native American, Latino, all of this, you know, so I could get my goodies. Because I have rules in war. When I kick an opponent's behind, I treat them with dignity and respect. You don't hear no bad mouthing from me, unless it's a way to beat you. And I've never had to do that. Now, Hannibal did. That was part of his strategy. And if it worked, I would. But other than that, it ain't my nature to begin with. I'm not going to humiliate you. Treat you with respect. And so by then I had him eating out of my hand. So I wanted some goodies for the department and got them. Got all kinds of goodies, all of them. So I was talking to my former student, Venus Nobles, and she said, President Corrigan was afraid of you. Well, guess what? When you're fearless, when you're standing for the truth, I didn't have no army. I wasn't threatening to beat anybody up. But that drives fear into your opponents. That's how you keep stress off of you. Delegate the stress to your enemies. But the main thing is when you free your mind, you transcend your circumstance. That was what Malcolm did. He transcended the mud of the streets of hustling and all that. He exaggerated. It wasn't as bad as he said it was, but it was bad enough. You could look at that picture. When they incarcerated him, he looked kind of slimy. I wouldn't want anybody around me that looked like that. He had some crooked looks in his face and stuff. But when he freed his mind, you could see a different Malcolm. You could see a discipline in that face. There are stages. If you just look at his face, you'll see stages in Malcolm. Because when he first came out, he was a Nation of Islam true believer, you know, just serious, dead on. And then over time, you see him mellowing out, but it's this conscious African. So when you have a free mind, you see beyond your circumstance. You live the moment and you do the best to take whatever you can out of it for your benefit, for the benefit of your people, for your family, for your community, but you also live in the future. You don't just live in the present. because what we've come here, we're all on a mission. We all picked a destiny. We all picked our time of birth. We all picked our parents. We all picked our talents. And the key to this is if you're pursuing your gifts, then what happens is that's the great joy in life. To be the best at whatever it is your gift, is your talent. And you pursue that. But you don't just pursue it for now. It's for hundreds of years from now. And when you free your mind, as Malcolm said, he never saw a Black person who hated Africa and loved himself. He said, if you're going to love a tree, you got to love the roots. Africa's our roots. We don't love all of it. It's the positives in it. And we only use the parts that we can use. And we use that which we have innovated and recreated here, because we've created a new African culture here. So as you do that, you go to another plane. Since I woke up, my work has been for African people. I don't care what I'm doing, it's for African people. And most of it is no pay. That's the greatest joy in life. You hear me? Serving your people, loving your people, and loving yourself, and serving humanity. Of course, the first people you serve is your own first. So, topic of this show was Malcolm X said Black people cannot have a negative view of Africa and a positive view of themselves. When you have this positive view, and when you undergo an awakening, that's when you really plunge into your past. And in plunging into the best of your past, you're able to go forward. And any movement that says that this is backward, because in the 60s you had organizations that called people who got into their culture backward and all the rest of this stuff, you are headed for real trouble. Because if you don't know your roots, you won't know yourself. And it's self-knowledge that's the key to everything. And when love is motivating you, you'll do your best work. So to the people of Africa, to our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and in Europe, and to my brothers and sisters here, the soul people here, the blues people, some of you hip hop people, hope you got something out of this. Free the mind. As the president of Funkadelic said, your behind will follow. That ain't what he said. I'm cleaning it up. But that's what he meant. Hotep. Let's see if you all got anything here. Is there anything here? Kevin, aka Mr. K. Malcolm's brother Wilfred said that once Malcolm left the NOA and went to Africa, his facial expression became more vibrant and upbeat, and especially in his smile. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But yes, I think that's probably true, because he was going back to his source and he was under a lot of pressure then. But in Africa, he was also able to rejuvenate himself. He was able to draw from Nyerere, from Nkrumah, from a host of other African leaders, insights and ideas, and from the people of Africa. And it strengthened him. And so you could see the rapid growth of Malcolm after he left the nation. He had been in the nation too long. Didn't really want to leave it either, because Elijah was like a father to him. But yeah, I think that's true. It wasn't just the beard, what you see, or the goatee. What you see is another level of growth. Wes Randall, let's see. Said Africans ain't got a damn thing to do with Black American reparations when we actually beat the British in the Revolution, just like we won a Civil War. Well, actually, reparations is a worldwide issue. And Africans are entitled to their reparations from the Europeans. The African in the Caribbean is entitled to theirs, depending upon which of these colonizers colonized them. In most cases, it's the British. We're entitled to ours. And so don't be putting anybody down for theirs. And then there's another part of it that I won't discuss here. It's bigger than that. But overall, it's a common movement. But while reparations is a long-term objective, you have to have short-term objectives of building power on your own. Because if you're waiting for white people to finally be forced to give up their reparations, well, that's going to take a while. And generally, reparations are given by the weak to the strong. The Jews get reparations from Germany because Germany was defeated, mainly by the Russians, secondarily by the British and the Free French and the Americans. But mainly the Russians crushed 200 German divisions and lost 27 million people. So if you're looking at the whole history of what's happened with African people and how we'll get reparations, look at how the Jews got reparations from Germany. They were defeated. The Americans pressured them, so they gave up some reparations. And what the Japanese got, 25,000, for those still alive, couldn't be called reparations, you know? Cinnabar, nationalize all the resources and kick the Euros out. Gold alone in Uganda and Burkina Faso is enough for all the continent to eat well, think well, and be well. Yeah, you know, along with the rest of our resources. But if you control the resource of your mind, you'll control the resources of your continent. Wes Randall, developed Europe, but can't develop Africa. I'm so glad that Africans let us know loud and clear that we ain't the same by not including us in the CARICOM suit against the British. I don't know what he's talking about there. Kevin, aka Mr. K, here's a book to read, How Africa Developed Europe by Nkwazi Nhemhango. Okay, yeah. Wes Randall, I hope they get a stronger belief in God than the British or the OG enslavers. Ain't nobody got time to keep trying to babysit a whole continent of grown people who in a lot of cases sold their own. Some Africans engaged in the slave trade, yes, and we have an issue with that. But Africans were also pulled into the transatlantic so-called slave trade, which was a European project. And it was Europe that grew out of this, that developed their wealth out of this, along with the genocide carried out against Native Americans and oppression of other people. So we were both put in that same common condition. And the thing is, Pan-Africanism is about one Africa. And it comes from Africans in America. That our power comes from unity. And if anybody doesn't see that, then they don't understand what power is. It's unity. Wolf Manley was saying blacks have been the impetus for African freedom and unity. Yeah, but they've also been the impetus for ours too. Those movements for liberation that occurred in the 60s, those movements encouraged us, just as our movements encouraged them. It's been mutual. in that respect. And don't forget Kwame Nkrumah, who said that Ghana would not be free until all of Africa was free. He also was a leader in bringing Africans in the US, the Caribbean, abroad from Europe, working in his government. And his best advisor was from the Caribbean, who was the chief organizer of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, who gave him the idea for the Organization of Afro-American Unity. That's George Padmore. So reframe your thinking, because if you don't think global, you're not thinking in terms of power, because power is global in this world. Wes Randall, how a whole continent got to keep begging us for help and we only 15% of a whole nation. It's actually pathetic when they own lineages run their countries that's named after their lineage. Nothing pathetic about it. They are reaching out to us after they have overthrown an oppressive government. And so what they're saying to us is those Blacks that want to come home and use some of their skills for African development, as many have. When my man, Brother Willie Mikasa Dada Ricks, went to Burkina Faso, one of the things he didn't show in his slides was a sister who's built a massive school in Burkina Faso from the United States. It's an African-American school, you know. Now, they have their own schools, but the fact that you have Blacks coming from this country and living in Africa, what's wrong with that? That's your homeland. You, Mr. Wes Randall, need to do some homework because you're wrong on that. Because that's power in the world. And those are our people. And just as we sent teams to work in Africa, we gained a lot of support from those movements in Africa for what we were doing, from Nyerere, from Nkrumah, from others, from Cabral. It's mutual. That's how the whites want you to think. Wolf Manlow, he's against Blacks being involved in any white-based system whatsoever. Yeah, well, that's fine. If you can pull that one off, fine. But the fact is, you're in this society, and right now, society's moving on us. What do we do? Okay, so if there's anything else here, if I have any question. Switchblade, I can't name one example of all the countries in Africa unifying and fighting the Europeans, and they are the majority within their own country. Well, first of all, Burkina Faso fought the whites and threw them out, right? And there are 3 countries that have unified together. So that's some unity. You haven't studied your history, Switchblade. Kwame Nkrumah, that was his whole move for Africa to unite. The point is, it's not going to be easy. There's never been a united continent anywhere in the world, let alone Africa. And in the past, it couldn't happen because there wasn't the technology and that kind of stuff, nor the mentality. We didn't come here as Africans. We came as Yoruba, Asante, whatever. It was us beginning to see Africa as a whole that called for this, but Africans began to see that on the continent as well. So that's a long-term struggle. Europeans have the European Union, but why do they have it? Because they nearly committed genetic genocide in World War II and World War I, where they nearly killed off their whole population, fighting each other. Pan-Africanism, or One Africa, this is about Africans unifying as one, based on what Bob Marley says, one love and one power. So y'all have been getting a lot of brainwashing on the ignorant on this. You need to get into the real world. And that's where power is. Why do you think Malcolm spent so much time in Africa? Think he was vacationing? He was there to learn from Africa as Africans were learning from him, and to come back here with more advanced strategies. His organization of Afro-American Unity was a takeoff of the Organization of African Unity. And he was making moves towards the end of his life to unify with these struggles, you know? And what is this? Malcolm X was a CIA asset. Give your proof. Countertextualists, where'd you get this from? The CIA poisoned him in Egypt. They viewed him as an enemy. M.S. Handler from the New York Times noted that. And he was a noted journalist on foreign policy. The CIA was afraid of him. A CIA asset. Where did you come up with this stuff? Y'all can't be blowing hot air. That's bull, pure bull. If you got some proof on that, show it. Where did you come up with this, brother? Switchblade. Africans have a negative view of African and Black Americans. To the extent that they do, it's the brainwashing that comes from the United States. It comes from that slave mentality. The majority of Africans do not. I spent time in Africa, a lot of time, and I spent time in the villages. The people in the villages treat you as your family. If you go back, you'll find that. A lot of them, they're not looking at, oh, you're from America and you're an ex-slave. They don't know that. What they know is what they see right in front of them. And so some of the best positive receptions I've received in life have been in Africa and in the South in the United States, where Blacks treat you with a lot more respect. And a lot of that is with the elite. But to the extent that Blacks have it, that's part of the programming that you expect your enemy to do and you have to undo. Gregory Jones. Mental enslavement is what allows the enslaver to remove the physical tools of physical enslavement. Yeah, but they don't really remove them because there's always force and violence behind everything, and they're not going to remove that. But for some who are on remote control, it's almost like, well, maybe they figure they can't do without it. Well, that's too bad. Shabaka, land is the basis of freedom. Need to control the land of Africa. That's true. Justice for the LPA. I wish that Africans would love themselves enough to develop their habitat. Well, a lot of us do. The problem is when we develop it, we could have a freeway run through it or redevelopment come in and tear it down, you know? So don't forget what leads us to be in this position. C Sweets. Thanks, brother. If that's a brother. Okay, let me go down here and see if there are any new ones. Yeah, Black Light. Africa is the fastest growing continent in the world and number one birth rate in the world. Yeah, pretty soon a majority, almost of the world's population will be African. And what you're seeing with Africa now, it's a young population, and that youth and that anger at the oppression they're facing internally, at Africans who are in power and abusing them, and externally from the Europeans, Americans, whatnot. That's fueling an awakening in Africa, and the youth are playing a big part in it. You know? Morrill Smith, thank you. Thanks, Cinnabar. Thanks for your help. Cinnabar plays a big role along with Brother Ugawa in making this show go right. What's the quickest way to divest the black brain from white thoughts? There's no quick way. You got to ground yourself. You got to know yourself, ground yourself in your own truths, your own history, your own culture, and be the best person you can be in terms of pursuing your gifts in the service of your people, in the service of humanity. And and then be able to take the good with the bad. Wes Randall, good point about Malcolm and the Plymouth Rock. Okay, I think that's it. Let me see if there's any more here. No, I haven't read this book. This brother here, Kevin, aka Mr. K, who made the point about Malcolm's facial changes when he came back from Africa. Let me write this down here. I'll check it out. That's what I like, when people give me some stuff that I don't have. So, Oba T'Shaka, are you familiar with the book Rising Wind and In Search for Power by Brenda Gale Plummer? They are must-reads on African and African Americans working together. So let me write this down. Rising Wind and Search for Power. Brenda Yeah, I'll check that out. Thank you. Chad Jomo Kenyatta, love family. Thank you, Master Teacher. I'm about to dot them I's and cross them T's and keep filling that paperwork. Right on. Oh, and someone had asked, what about my books? I know that a number of people have ordered books. I'm going to get them to them. It's the first time I've ever been derelict in this. I will get them to them. And you can get my books through me. Okay, that looks like it's it. I hope you got something out of this. Hotep. Oh, I wanted to say one other thing. I should have said this in the beginning. I said this last week briefly. A beautiful brother has passed to the next life. Brother Imhotep Akabulan. He was minister of Wose Church in Sacramento. Wose means the African way. Beautiful brother. He had me on. I did a couple of shows with him, 2 or 3 or 4. And he lived into his early 60s, had a serious case of cancer that took him out just recently. There's going to be a memorial for him next week outside of Sacramento, California, where he lives. This is a former student of mine. I had him when I first started teaching at San Francisco State. And he is one of my best students because he took whatever he got, not just from me, but from others, and applied it in serving our people. And he's a spiritual person, so he especially applied it on the spiritual plane. So it's a real loss for us and a gain for heaven. And I know he'll be looking down on us. And Gloria Briscoe, thank you very much. And LaShonda Henderson, thanks. So Hotep, until the next time.